welcome everybody again to another episode of the ideaXme show that profiles the human beings behind the really big ideas that are shaping our world and inspiring future creators. And for all those that like great stories, I'm Ira Pastor. I'm your health, aging, and longevity ambassador along for this journey. And for the last several shows, we've been spending time at different hierarchical levels of health, disease, and aging. And we've been discussing that aging is an extremely complex process controlled by nested hierarchies that expand from the very small, our genes, proteins, gene regulatory networks, on up through more complex physiological level networks at the level of cells, tissue, organs, and then, of course, into the organism's complex internal and external microenvironments. We've talked a bit about the micro-biome, the macro-biome, and today we're going to talk about a topic that we haven't delved much into yet, which I refer to as the complex, we'll call cosmo-biologic dynamics that affect our health and wellness. And when I refer to cosmo-biologic, I'm referring to the increasing amount of evidence in the scientific literature that shows how big factors affect major parts of our biology and health. Things on this list include gravity, most recently popularized by the Kelly twins experiment with one astronaut going up to the International Space Station and one staying on Earth, and the study of the gene expression differences. We talk about the Earth's natural electromagnetic field, sound, acoustics, and then light, of course, solar and lunar cycles, and ultimately time itself, and the fascinating field of chronobiology, which is what we're going to be speaking about today. So, chronobiology is basically defined as the field of biology that examines periodic cyclic phenomena in living organisms, cycles broadly known as biologic rhythms. The more well-known of these in the general public is the circadian rhythm, sort of defined as any biologic process that displays this endogenous oscillation of every 24 hours, seen across the biologic kingdom in plants, animals, fungi, and so forth. Although there's many types of rhythms of different durations, tidal, weekly, seasonal, annual, and of course, out there in the grand scheme of the cosmos, there's much longer rhythms that we really don't perceive. There are related terms of chronomics and the chronome, which are used to describe the complex molecular mechanisms involved in chronobiological phenomena. And these rhythms show up everywhere in our physiology. The most obvious, of course, to everyone is, of course, sleep. But we see rhythms across our biologic architecture, from the secretion of certain hormones to blood pressure modulation, to body temperature fluctuations, to the suppression of urine and bowel function, even down to the level of gene oscillations, and recent discoveries that some genes are expressed more certain times of the day than others. And this is all extremely important in the way we look at disease, the way we look at health, and ultimately how we try to intervene in these processes, from heart disease to diabetes to cancer and so forth. So today we have a fascinating guest who is really at the epicenter of these activities, who is going to take us further along the theme and into the future. And that is Dr. Germaine Cornelissen-Guillaume. She is the professor, Department of Integrated Biology and Physiology at the Halberg Chronobiology Center at the University of Minnesota. With a PhD from the University of Brussels in physics, Dr. Cornelissen-Guillaume has been actively pursuing research in this area for the last few decades, publishing an extensive amount of papers on the dynamic, and is clearly a major thought leader in this space. So with that introduction, Dr. Cornelissen-Guillaume, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
So we typically just start off by giving our guests the floor to learn a little bit more about you, your background, how you got interested in science, of course, physics, and ultimately how you made this transition into the epicenter of quite an exciting area of what I'll call biophysics, biology and physics combined.
Okay, well, I really started to do my PhD in a laboratory that was concerned with frequency standards, which was really both the measure of time and also the keeping of the epoch. So we were working with atomic clocks, and we were concerned about all of the factors that may bring noise into the system and trying to minimize it. And some of the software that we were developing at the time started interesting the biologists who were interested in the signal and not in the noise.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where the transition occurred, really going from noise to signal.
Understood.
Primarily, and then I met in Paris Dr. Franz Halberg, who is really a pioneer in the field. I mean, circadian rhythms were not called that at the time. I mean, when he started, the people had noticed that there were fluctuations of about a day, but it remained primarily a curiosity at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And the work of Franz Halberg really put chronobiology on the map and made it as a discipline in its own right by really measuring all kinds of phenomena and demonstrating rigorously statistically that in the absence of environmental synchronizers, our body followed still the same cycle with a period that was slightly different from exactly 24 hours. And of course, these were validated many times, and now he also coined both the terms circadian and chronobiology. And so, so that's how it all started. I met him, invited me to come to his lab for the summer, and we kind of enjoyed working together, and I came back. So it has been a really long journey, and we were interested in not just circadian rhythm, and thank you for mentioning all of the other frequencies that are also very important. Today, circadian rhythms are receive a little bit more of the limelight because of the Nobel Prize that was awarded to last year to three mostly geneticists who found who contributed knowledge about the genes underlying the circadian rhythms. But what is really fascinating is that these genes that underlie the circadian system are not only responsible for our having circadian rhythms, they are also very important for our health. Because if there are disruptions in those clock genes, all kinds of bad things happen to you, from cardiovascular disease to metabolic problems, diabetes, addiction, you name it. It's really a fundamental part of our being. And what Dr. Halberg used to say is that there wouldn't be any life without cycles. And you know, if you look at it, you know, brainwaves, heartbeat, REM cycle, all the way to about 11-year cycles, where we found in really very long records of blood pressure, heart rate, and other variables in some cases, that if you measure long enough and you analyze those data, you also find invariably these really long cycles that mimic the solar activity cycle. And that's also very fascinating because we are not isolated. We live in an environment that has cycles as well.
Right. That's yeah. I've always, you know, we are but one of millions of species on this planet. We have all evolved on a, you know, this is a planet. It rotates every 24 hours and exposes us to a certain amount of day and night and light and dark, and it makes complete sense that, you know, this sort of synchronicity or whatever between these cycles, even, you know, that 24-hour level, yeah, it makes complete sense, and it's just it's a very elegant way to sort of, when you stand back and look at it, to really appreciate, as you said, the connectedness, even in the basics of the circadian rhythm. Speaking of sort of that for a minute, before we get into some of the diseases and sort of the therapeutic possibilities, we talk about sleep for a moment, because this is sort of the one rhythm that I guess most people are the most familiar with. We are always obviously told from a young age, get your sleep. It's your body recharges and it's good for you, and all sorts of wonderful things happen while we sleep. Although it was funny, I read where it was an article recently that talked about this phenomena of sleeping through the night for humans is kind of recent in an evolutionary scheme of things. I think a couple hundred years ago, we used to sleep differently. We get up in the middle of the night and plant or do more agricultural stuff and whatever. But could you talk a little bit sort of just about sleep in general as a cycle and its importance, I guess, in connecting to some of these other smaller or lower level
sure. I mean,
cycles that you have in the process?
Sure. Sleep is just one part of what is happening within the circadian system,
Mm-hmm.
and whether it's a single span of sleep or whether it's in two parts, I don't think that's really so much the matter. What is important is that it's not disrupted.
Mm-hmm.
And for instance, if you look at what is happening in shift workers,
Mm-hmm.
that they are at a higher risk for a number of problems, from cancer to cardiovascular disease. And so that's because they do not have a regular schedule.
Okay.
The other issue is if you look at the problems of being exposed mostly to blue light late at night, or taking food really late in the day.
Mm-hmm.
These are also lifestyle events that will disturb the circadian system.
Mm-hmm.
And so by disturbing it, what really happens is that the circadian amplitude, not just of activity, but also of temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, a number of other variables like growth hormone and all of the repair mechanisms that do occur at night, they are being disturbed. And so they are not occurring the way they should.
Mm-hmm.
And that is in part the reason why these disturbances are associated with poorer health.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. What are the most, so I've looked through, you've published extensively in the field, and I've seen papers in this space on obviously heart rhythms, blood pressure, hormone secretions, connections potentially to cancer. What are you most interested in from sort of a therapeutic perspective, and what are some of the things you're working on in that context in terms of the connection of all of these concepts to only what is I believe referred to as either chronotherapy or chronotherapeutics?
Right. And so if we focus for a short while on the circadian rhythm, because
Mm-hmm.
that's where most of the work is being done,
Mm-hmm.
Mostly related to the medical field.
Mm-hmm.
We have to realize that circadian rhythms are really of different orders.
Okay.
The first order are the spontaneous rhythms, like, for instance, you put a Fitbit on or you put a blood pressure cuff on, and you measure variables like activity, temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, different things. And you will see that those measurements are not the same all day, they are not constant, and they are not varying randomly either. They have a pattern. For instance, temperature, blood pressure, heart rate, they all are lower during sleep and rest, and they're higher when you're awake and active.
Okay.
Along with these spontaneous circadian rhythms are also response rhythms. And so, and that is to a large extent what is underlying chronotherapy, and what was demonstrated and documented very over and over and over again
Mm-hmm.
by all of the studies that Dr. Halberg did, is that these response rhythms are very critical and can make the difference between life and death. For instance, in the laboratory, if you just take a mouse and you restrict access to food to 4 hours in a day, and you house those mice one per cage.
Mm-hmm.
And if you offer the food when they are usually active, most of them will survive. But if you do exactly the same and offer the same amount of food during the same 4-hour span, but during a time when they are normally resting, asleep, then most of them die.
Ah.
And that's just one extreme. But if you jingle a bell to mice that are sensitive to noise, same thing. You do it at one time and they all survive. You do it another time, they all die.
Mm-hmm.
We tested anti-cancer drug after anti-cancer drug from doxorubicin, platinum, vincristine, aracin, melphalan, all of those different drugs. We had very nice facilities that were on staggered lighting regimen. So they were on 12 hours of light alternating with 12 hours of darkness.
Mm-hmm.
But one room, the light went on, let's say, at 8 in the morning, and in a different room, they came on at noon, and another one at 4 in the afternoon. So you could come and inject that drug in the same dosage to all of those mice, more or less at the same time. And then you would wait until half of them had died overall, and then you were counting how many survived in each of the rooms, and you could tell, well, the highest toxicity happened around this circadian stage for this drug, or at that circadian stage for that drug. And whether you do that with anti-cancer drugs or with antihypertensive drugs or with any kind of medication, most of these have a very strong response circadian rhythm. So that you can use this information to minimize toxicity, but also to improve efficacy of the drug. And what we have found recently in relation to cardiovascular disease with colleagues in Japan is that it's very important to optimize the timing of treatment on a personal basis, not just do big studies. I'm trying, morning versus evening. And there are some very nice trials going on showing that on the average, it's better if you give the drug in the evening because it brings blood pressure down more, and on the average, it will help more people. The problem is that some people will have one kind of abnormal circadian rhythm where they have really very high blood pressure during the day and very low blood pressure during the night. In that case, you want to bring the blood pressure down during the day and not so much during the night when it's already low. But other people, like diabetic patients who have also autonomic nervous dysfunction, they tend to have high blood pressure during the night and not so high blood pressure during the day. In those cases, you want to bring the blood pressure down during the night and not so much during the day. So the best timing to administer the medication differs depending on the chronodiagnosis.
Fascinating.
And so you have to personalize. And the other thing that we found is that having high blood pressure in itself, yes, overall it increases the risk for having cardiovascular problems.
Sure.
But high blood pressure is not the only culprit. Abnormal circadian patterns of blood pressure and heart rate also play a very large role, like having high blood pressure during the night when it shouldn't be, or having too large a circadian amplitude, which is too much of an excursion between day and night in blood pressure. That's very bad. Even if you do not have an average blood pressure that is too high, having this abnormal pattern can really raise your risk of stroke immensely. And so what is very important is to bring to the clinic those screening tools to show, yes, if you detect these abnormal circadian patterns of blood pressure and heart rate, you can prevent adverse events to occur by doing actually primary prevention, because those abnormalities are occurring within the physiological range, and you don't have to wait until there is overt disease because you have symptoms and you have values that go outside of the physiological range. So there are different ingredients here. One is monitoring, one is analyzing the data, recognizing abnormal circadian patterns of variability in these variables, acting in a timely fashion for primary prevention, and then you can actually decrease the number of adverse events, basically.
Fascinating.
And this is all coming together today because you have all of these gadgets. Blood pressure is still the hardest to come by, but progress is being made slowly. You can do heart rate easily. You can do temperature, activity much more easily. But blood pressure is still a little bit of a challenge. But there's progress being made in that area also. And you can always get an ABPM, except that people don't like them because it's hard to watch. But some of us have done it for years, and you do surveillance, and you can tell whether something is changing, and you can tell earlier. You don't have to wait. And also single measurements, which is what is done in the clinic, will not tell you about abnormal patterns. They will only tell you whether it's outside the range or not.
Right. Fascinating. Really fascinating. Along the lines of you've written about what you refer to as a chronome. What does that look like? I mean, are there sets of genes that you've isolated that are related to these processes in terms of how we I'm speaking outside my skill set here, but how we sense night versus day. What are some of the potential in terms of creating, I don't know if you call this chromomimetics in terms of drugs or gene therapies? Does this involve a more sort of photo modulation technologies? Where do you see sort of the future of some of these different interventions beyond the monitoring?
Well, the monitoring serves as a guide for timing treatment. That's really the essence of the monitoring, making sure that everything is fine, and if you find some deviation, don't become an hypochondriac, just do some more testing, and if it's real, then do something about it. And doing something about it is not necessarily taking a medication. It can be also lifestyle modification, exercise. A lot of some of the risk is coming from these disturbed circadian rhythms. So one possibility is to strengthen the circadian system by having regular habits. That's one way, and doing exercise and taking melatonin in the evening to is also a help. Which it's more like a supplement. It's not really it's something that we have in our body anyway. So to answer your broader question about chronomes, the term really came because we were at a meeting on clinical chemistry in San Francisco some years ago, and we had our little group presenting results in chronobiology, and there were parallel sessions, and in the next room was people talking about the genome, and it was packed full. So we were flying from San Francisco back to Washington to meet people at NIH. And on the plane, Franz and I were discussing, and we thought, well, maybe we should come up with a concept that would be just as attractive as the genome, and that's how Chronome came about.
Ah.
But so genome is really the set of genes.
Uh-huh.
And the clock genes are those genes that are, underlying the circadian system.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know much about other genes that may be responsible for some of those other cycles. And I wish some work would be done in that, in that field too, because, for instance, the week is something really fascinating. And we don't know. I mean, many people say, well, that's just because this is our own construct. We have a 7-day week, and
right.
That's why we have weekly rhythms.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't account for the fact that if you do organ transplantation and you look at the risk of rejection of an organ, whether you do the surgery on a Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, whether it's in Minneapolis, in Milan, Italy, or Paris, France, the risk of rejection is high, maybe a few days after the surgery, and then the risk decreases. But 7 days after the first peak, it increases again. Increases and then increases again. And the interval between episodes of high risk of rejection is about 7 days.
Wow.
If you look at blood pressure and heart rate in babies, they practically don't have a circadian rhythm. They have a very small one, a very small amplitude rhythm at birth that is changing very rapidly within the first months of life. But next to that, they have a very strong about 7-day cycle.
Okay.
And it's not something that is determined in relation to Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on. It's the phase is set by the time they were born. So it's a developmental issue. So it's the organism that is responding to the process of birth. And in many ways, I mean, birth is a very big event, and in many instances, those about 7-day cycles gain in prominence after a single stimulus.
Wow.
Birth can be looked upon as being that stimulus for the baby, but transplantation is another stimulus. And other people in Germany have found, for instance, that if patients go for balneotherapy, they also have responses that are related to this 7-day cycle in relation to the treatment that they are receiving, not in relation to the day of the week.
Wow.
And so some of the studies have been done to show that you can also optimize treatment by modulating the dosing of a medication along the week. Just the same way as you can do it along the scale of the day.
Amazing.
But very little work is being done in that area because people say, oh, it's just social. No, it isn't. It's more than social.
Yeah, seems like there should be a lot of effort in diving further into that. And by the way, I really think that the name Chronome is cool.
Okay.
It sounds cooler than the genome anyway. But no, thank you for that answer. I wanted to move to the topic of aging now. You wrote I read a paper you wrote, I think back in 2017. It was called The Chronobiology of Aging, where you speak about aging, again, being a dynamic that correlates with the weakening of the circadian system. And you mentioned some different things in the paper about calorie restriction, which is sort of this associated as sort of one method of life extension, potentially in mammals, which is associated with increased circadian amplitudes. You also reference some work that goes back to Dr. Hapberg in the 1970s, where there's certain lesioning experiments done in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, an area of the brain which controls several different peptides and neurotransmitters involved with circadian rhythm. Could you just give us your top line thoughts on chronobiology, chronotherapy, and the future of aging as we talk about it?
Yes. If you look at one of the things we have done, over the many years, we have really mapped circadian rhythms from newborns to centenarians.
Mm-hmm.
We have done that for blood pressure and heart rate, and we have done that for some indices of heart rate variability. And so we have done that basically in clinical health in order to obtain reference values that are time specified and then are also qualified by gender and age, because women are different from men. They have like a low blood pressure and a high heart rate. And they also, the circadian characteristics are changing as a function of age. As I mentioned to you, a baby, first day of life still already has a circadian rhythm, but it's a very small amplitude, and it's peaking right after midnight. And so normally the peak is in the afternoon, and during the first months of life, that acrophase is going to move from the night to the afternoon. And different babies do that in different ways. Some do it abruptly, others do it more gradually. Some do it by phase advance, others do it by phase delay. But after about a month, the circadian system starts to be detectable and more timed more similarly to what is found in adults. And then through infancy and adolescence, the circadian amplitude is increasing, as it does for many different variables, also different lipids and different antioxidants. And then once you reach about mid-adulthood and so on, then some of those circadian amplitudes will start decreasing. Systolic blood pressure, the circadian amplitude can stay high relatively long.
Okay.
Also, it increases until around 80 years of age or so. Diastolic blood pressure peaks around 50 years and then start decrease. And the circadian amplitude also will be decreasing as a function of age. Very surprisingly, if you compare the relative prominence of the week versus the day, it's very high in newborns, and it's getting higher again in the elderly.
Okay.
And so there is this transposition of variance, of variability, from one frequency domain to another frequency domain, from the circadian to other cycles.
That's fascinating.
So the circaseptan or the week is one, but also some of the ultradian rhythms, so some of the shorter rhythms, like 12 hours, 8 hours, and so on. The phase is also changing. Like usually it's a phase advance. So when people get older, their circadian system is shifted as an advance. So they tend to wake up earlier and go to bed earlier, and all the variables follow.
That's happening to me lately. Maybe it's because there's a bunch of kids in the house now, but yeah.
Now this amplitude decrease and acrophase advance is a pattern that we have also observed after doing suprachiasmatic lesioning in plants. And at the time, many people said, well, you know, if you remove the suprachiasmatic nuclei, all the rhythms are abolished. And it's now being recognized slowly that not all rhythms are obliterated, that at least in our studies, the amplitude is much smaller and the phase is slightly advanced. And it's true for temperature, and it's true for DNA synthesis in much of the digestive system.
Wow.
And so that's why there is the possibility that aging can be related to some kind of a weakening of the central clock, which is kind of orchestrating all of the peripheral clocks, because every cell has its own circadian mechanism.
Yeah, we're hearing so much more about that today with sort of the discovery of some of these you know, epigenetic clocks at the cellular level, and it's just to think about it in the grand scheme that, you know, we have these 50 trillion cells and they all are ticking away in this unique manner and such synchronicity is, yeah, it's just.
And then it's not just our own cells; it's also the cells of all of the microbiome, which is
right. You know, that's another 100 trillion or so. That's
which is another area completely. But yes, I mean, so if you want to have healthy aging, in a way, what you can try to do is to keep a strong circadian system, basically. You know, so keep a regular schedule, eat well, don't eat too late at night, don't be exposed to blue light late at night, use a dark room, you know, no noise during, you know, don't keep the radio on or the TV on or whatever.
I think I violated all, but I'll.
But I mean, everything that can consolidate the circadian system will be helpful, basically.
That's very, very important and very actionable.
I mean, the time-restricted feeding is just one mechanism through which, you know, it's just another synchronizer. It's apparently a synchronizer that acts independently of the light-dark schedule as a synchronizer of circadian rhythm. So you can really use both, and that's why and it doesn't necessarily need to be just a single 4-hour span during which you can eat. You can. There are many protocols. There are even people who made patents about the schedule of, you know, not necessarily just to lose weight, but also to remain healthy, basically. You know, then there are all those alternate day feeding and all kinds of different ways. But in the laboratory, it has been shown that you can actually, and that was done way before people were interested in the circadian system, by just decreasing the number of calories, you can increase longevity.
Right.
At least in the lab.
Hopefully that'll translate.
It's harder to do with people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Very difficult to do. But yeah. Well, I appreciate all of this. I mean, this is marvelous insight, and, you know, you're a fountain of knowledge in this area. I wanted to just briefly transition now. We typically, as we get near the end of the show, we transition away from the science into sort of more of the science fiction. But I wanted to pose a question that we pose to every guest. Now, you clearly, and, you know, you spent time working with Dr. Hallberg and pioneering this area, so you clearly had you're a major thought leader in the space. He was a major mentor, thought leader for you. I want to ask you a question about who you, Dr. Cornelissen-Guillaume, what historical figure, if you had the chance, would you have liked to meet? It doesn't have to be in science. It could be in literature, philosophy, sports, whatever. If you had the chance to meet that one person, now obviously you met Dr. Hallberg, that doesn't count. Who would it be? Who would it be for you?
Oh, I think maybe Albert Einstein. He didn't publish much, but what he published is amazing. And people are still figuring out whether, I mean, and so far, many of the new experiments that are being done, still prove it was correct. So that's just so much insight and so much.
Right.
And it would have been fascinating to
have a little chat.
Another person is Feynman.
Okay. Okay.
Richard Feynman.
Absolutely. Absolutely. He had that great part of his was a book on quantum theory that he starts off by saying, you won't understand this book.
He had a very interesting way of working. He was saying it's not so important to know how to name things. It's more important to understand how they work.
Sure.
And that is a fundamental truth.
Definitely. Well, I just want to thank you. It's been an honor for you to join us today. It's such a pleasure having you. Sharing your knowledge and really moving forward this area that personally I believe needs so much more attention, especially that we have these rhythms, we have this synchronicity from the very small to the cosmic scale levels of this universe, and thank you for everything that you do in the space and moving it forward. Dr. Cornelissen-Guillaume, Dr. Germaine Cornelissen-Guillaume, Professor, Department of Integrated Biology and Physiology at the Hellberg Chronobiology Center at the University of Minnesota. Everyone can check out your website. We will link to that and other materials of yours. But once again, thank you so much for joining us, and really appreciate you sharing the knowledge with us.
Thank you.